This week in Colorado Springs, progress took a step backward. On November 18th, the City Planning Commission crafted zoning laws that would impose their moral objection to medical marijuana on many of the medical dispensaries, the medical marijuana dispensaries operating here in town. The comments that were made it pretty obvious what they were trying to accomplish with these new zoning regulations.
Yeah, but we want to say something about Colorado Springs, and I guess I personally don't want to be known as the marijuana capital of Colorado, where we have one everywhere. And so I'm inclined to support the 1,000 feet as a way to kind of send a message about, we value the drug and alcohol treatment and our children, and the more we can do to not send them a message that medicinal marijuana is something different. I don't know, I think I said this at the first hearing, the thing that bothers me the most is that we're trying to make something legal that from a federal government perspective is illegal. And so, I'm being asked to make decisions about dealing with something that I personally believe is illegal. And I just would like to have the commission consider 1,000-foot spacing between retail centers. And, the issue is, again, I think what we want to say about our community. There are parts of our community. At first, I wasn't too concerned about it because they mapped us the impact of the schools and the spacing on some of the areas in town, and that already does affect a certain number of businesses will be excluded because of that. But then there are areas of town that are retail centers, and it was pointed out to me, taking like Academy Boulevard. And there aren't really very many schools near Academy. And if we were to have 400-foot spacing, you could envision those strip malls, one every 400 feet. And I'm not sure, and I understand the argument about competition and the marketplace controlling this. I'm torn, and so I would like to have a discussion about it among the commissioners.
I have one comment. It kind of came out of my tour. I learned a lot on the tours, and I was told by one of the people on the tour that, because we were discussing some of the issues, and said, well, that's not to worry about it. The ultimate goal is to legalize this use recreationally. And I know some of you have that intent, some don't, but quite frankly, as a father, I can't promote moving this forward for recreational, under the concept that the idea is for eventually for recreational legalization. I believe that we were functioning well under the constitutional amendment, and that until the feds changed the enforcement standard, it was going along. So I can, as a father, I just can't do it. So I'm going to vote against this.
I'm going to say a little bit more. This is a very important issue for our community that will define our city for years to come. And I recognize that the Cannabis Council is an important stakeholder in this issue, and I do thank them for their valuable input. I did learn a lot from them. However, they're not the only ones that are impacted by this policy. The Planning Commission represents a level playing field for our community where everyone can express their views. It is the Planning Commission and not the Cannabis Council who is in the best position to recommend zoning and land use policy to City Council. I am proud of our efforts to reach out to all institutions in this city and to invite everyone to participate. What I learned during these hearings was that some institutions gave considerable input and other institutions chose not to participate. What I also learned was that there was a strong desire from our educational institutions for a buffer around schools. This applies to early learning centers, preschools, K-12 education, colleges, and universities. Every planning commissioner here brings the experiences, their life experiences to their position and to their job. As for me, I'm a mother, I'm a businesswoman, and I'm a former school board president. I am very concerned that the proliferation of centers will increase drug usage among our youth. And and undermine all the work that our community has done to increase high school graduation rates. No amount of tax revenue will make up for that societal cost. Already, we are seeing an increase in student expulsions for marijuana use and an increase in arrests for driving under the influence of marijuana. A recent Harvard study confirmed the negative changes to the brain caused by smoking marijuana regularly before the age of 16. As a planning commissioner, I am also very uncomfortable approving ordinances for businesses that I know are in violation of federal law. This is a major disconnect for me, like Carla, and has made my decision difficult. The Denver Post has reported that legitimate medical marijuana users are less than 4% of the total market, yet we are going to extraordinary lengths to accommodate them. I have listened to the Cannabis Council, and I understand that our zoning requirements will impact some businesses. However, it's not the responsibility of the Planning Commission to manage risk for business owners. Every one of these marijuana businesses knew that they were an illegal land use when they opened up, and they all knew that they were making financial investments before zoning and licensing requirements were developed. There were no guarantees. It was their choice and their risk assumption, and I respect their right to make that risk assumption. If the federal government changes its enforcement policies, they could still be shut down tomorrow. The risk and the responsibility is up to them. I support this motion because the zoning does make sense to me, and because the 1,000-foot buffer around schools is consistent with the federal No Child Left Behind legislation for 1,000-foot drug-free zones, and because 1,000 feet is recommended in the Colorado House Bill 1284, which legalizes centers. I also support it because our educational institutions have asked for it. I support the 1,000-foot buffer around drug treatment facilities because I respect their work and I want to support their efforts. I know that the entire Planning Commission listened very carefully to all the testimony and gave this issue their very best thinking. Given our many constraints as a land use council, I believe that we are recommending to City Council a very fair and balanced policy.
I'm going to support this, and I'm going to go on record with a statement that our city council may not like. But as a long-time city employee, and certainly now as a community volunteer, I understand the financial constraints the city is under. And I really resent the fact that as a city council, they seem to have been motivated by one thing and one thing only, and that's the revenue that comes to the general fund. And this is an unpopular statement to them. I know they're not going to like hearing that, but as a citizen, we have a responsibility about our community and how it looks, and I think we're selling our soul to the devil if we make all our decisions based on how much money we're going to get from a business. It's how I feel. I'm going to support the ordinance. I really, as I've said repeatedly, we are creating something that violates federal law, and it really hurts to have to do that, but I understand we're here for the land use. I think we have compromised as best we can to meet the needs of the Cannabis Council, the industry, and the concerns of the people that live here, and I hope that City Council will take our input as input from the community and not just look at it from a revenue point of view.
There was definitely some hostility toward the medical marijuana dispensaries in the commissioners' meeting. Some were a little more open about it than others. But the one prevailing thought that encompassed the whole meeting was that somehow medical marijuana is a illicit activity, that these dispensaries are somehow running an underground business that these poor commissioners were forced to approve of by regulating them. Now, just to be fair, there were a couple points in the meeting that a few of the counselors had some common sense and made some fairly intelligent statements and put a nix on really taking these things to the extreme of ruling out the whole city. One of the ways that this was done is it was proposed to limit, to create a buffer zone around parks, libraries, and religious institutions. Well, if you've lived in Colorado Springs for a month, you know that we have a religious institution on every block. And one of the commissioners stated that, this would essentially rule out dispensaries anywhere in the city. So I'll give them props for that. But by creating these buffer zones, they have ruled out a lot of the city, and they're going to put the estimate from K through 12 for creating I believe it was, 1,000 foot, but between K through 12 and the dispensaries was 60 dispensaries out of business. By adding preschools to that, which there's 400 listed in the city's documents, that means 400 places around this city, there's going to be 1,000 foot buffer between the dispensaries. Now I have to ask you, how in the world does it make any sense to create 1,000 foot buffer around a preschool? We don't have preschoolers toddling their way into medical marijuana dispensaries, looking for medical marijuana to relieve diaper rash. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's obvious. Again, if you were to look at all of the previous meetings in this, we have gone from 250 feet suggested by the Marijuana Task Force, Medical Marijuana Task Force, which included Sean Page and Tom Gallagher from the City Council, our elected leaders, not our appointed leaders, like the Planning Commission. But that task force suggested 250 feet between K through 12 and dispensaries. At one of the City Council meetings, that distance was kicked around a little bit. There was one counselor who suggested 1,000 foot distance. Now, but the majority of those counselors agreed to 400 feet. That was a compromise that they had reached. And this is what the city staff drew up before the first planning commission meeting. But then, when they had this planning commission meeting, when they opened it up to the public, the same voices were back that have been at every step of the way opposing medical marijuana because they have moral issues with it or because they don't like the way it looks on our city. After the planning commission meeting, I had an opportunity to talk to Mark Slough of the Cannabis Council. And I just wanted to hear from Mark what the effects of this were going to be from somebody who is a little better involved in the situation. Mark Slough. Mark, thank you very much. We just sat through the County Planning Commission.
Yes,
I have to get these words right.
The city planning commission that basically decided the fate of about 41% of the businesses that they're going to be recommending to City Council on whether or not to ban here in Colorado Springs. The proposed ordinance increased distances that they've had in place since June at 400 feet to 1,000 feet and essentially puts at risk about 41% of the industry or 60 centers. These centers are fully compliant, have already filed their state applications, paid $7,500 fees to the state, have also paid $500 pre-applications with the city, according to certain licensing provisions, which they're now creating a licensing ordinance for the industry. What they've done instead is increased these arbitrary zone limits from schools, seminaries, universities, and colleges, as well as other facilities like drug and alcohol treatment facilities, to try and persuade or eliminate many of these centers that they don't feel, according to some of the commissioners, that are an integral part of our community or representation of Colorado Springs culture. So apparently marijuana is symbolically removed from the culture by these actions, and that's really their intent.
Thankfully, the Planning Commission doesn't have the last word on this because it's a legislative matter. It has to go before the City Council for approval. So this is going to be our chance to let our City Council know that we expect to be led by elected leaders and not appointed leaders who are here to protect the interests of the big players in town. So I would just encourage you, get a hold of your city councilman, let them know that 1,000 foot separation is just ridiculous and that we can't afford to be putting 600 people or more out of work in this economy. This has been Daniel Freisinger for Pikes Peak Weekly.